Hello, hi, thank you all for being here. We're really excited to get started. And yeah, just to reiterate, as Heidi mentioned, we are now recording, just so everyone's aware of that. So we'd like to kick off this discussion with a land acknowledgement, because we are gathering virtually from across Canada, also known as Canada, on the unceded territory of different Indigenous communities. Teesri Theatre operates and produces our plays on the unceded territory of the Ganyan Kahaka people, who are the custodians of the lands, waters, and resources. We intend this land acknowledgement to openly discuss our responsibility to redress the generations of colonial violence that is the legacy of settlers on this land. And we do this to encourage folks to further educate themselves on the historical and current colonial forces that have and continue to shape present day life across Turtle Island, and to further take action to support Indigenous anti-colonial struggles to return unceded lands, stop the development of pipelines, and end the violence perpetrated against Indigenous peoples and their traditional lands. Sexual violence is a symptom of the larger capital and colonialist system that Canada is based off of, and that it continues to perpetuate. So we cannot speak of consent among institutions and individuals without also acknowledging, unpacking, and actively addressing the ongoing non-consensual relationship that the colonial institution known as Canada has with Indigenous communities. The pandemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the incarceration of Indigenous peoples, and the destruction of Indigenous institutions, families, and ways of living are all symptoms of this same colonial legacy that continue today. Thank you. Yeah, so again, we're just getting started. I'm just going to give you a bit of background. This is our first Zoom discussion panel to address sexual violence and some of the intersections between sexual violence and the other things that we've all been working on. So I'm really excited to get us started. Thank you, Heidi, for kicking us off and for having us here. My name's Summer. I am an immigrant and settler here. I'm a student, and I'm also working with Teesri on the project Going Public. That is a community program that sort of brings art together with activism to engage in survivor-centered discussion surrounding sexual violence, some of the cultural issues that allow a culture of sexual violence to continue and to redress that trauma and move forward. So Teesri Dunya, as a theater company, our mandate focuses on political theater, important theater, and on actual meaningful representation of marginalized voices, stories, and bodies. And so we will be mindful of that throughout this discussion and in our work on the project. And if anyone has any questions about any of that or the project or anything like that, I'm happy to hear from that in the latter part of this, which will be a Q&A period, or via email or chat later. Feel free to reach out to me. And I will hand it off to Chantelle to introduce herself.
Great, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Chantelle Spicer. I use she, her pronouns. I am of Mi'kmaq and Jewish ancestry, though because colonialism and capitalism and the patriarchy are really awful, I'm really disconnected from all of my lineage on both sides of my family tree. And I am the current co-chair of Students for Consent Culture Canada. So me and the amazing team that I work with are part of the only national student survivor-led organization that addresses sexualized violence in Canada. So we're an organization that's dedicated to supporting intersectional and grassroots anti-sexualized violence advocacy on campuses across Canada. And we do that by serving as a hub of resources and tools and institutional memory for students to engage in. Just in November, we celebrated our 2nd birthday, but we also did this work through Our Turn, which led to the creation of the Our Turn National Action Plan, which I'm sure at some point we will mention. But yeah, that's kind of briefly what we do. And I know that we're going to have a slide at the end that tells you more about where you can find us online and through our social media.
I'm next. Yeah, so I'm Sam, she, her pronouns. I am the current education lead, former outreach lead for SFCC. I've been here since the beginning of SFCC, so since 2018. Very excited to be here today and talk kind of about my research area for my master's degree, and how policies and institutions suck on the whole, and how we can make them better and do better in life. And then I'll pass it to Connor.
Hello, I'm Connor. I use she, her pronouns, coming to you from rural Quebec, and I am the former chair of SFCC, so I'm a past generation and a current lead researcher in our open secrets report that we're doing, which we'll probably mention a little bit later. And I currently work in
Great. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, we're super excited to have Chantelle, Connor, and Sam here and to get an opportunity to have a scheduled chat with them because I know you're all very busy folks in life. So I'm really excited as well to have this. Yeah, so we're just going to get started. I think we're going to start with Sam, who I understand you've been recently completing your master's research project on the intersectional implications surrounding the discourse of campus sexual violence policies at Ontario colleges, all from a socio-legal lens. So in other words, you've worked a lot with policy and issues surrounding sexual violence and institutions. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on that. Why don't these policies work, and how does that relate with sexual violence in an institutional context?
Yes. So as mentioned before, master's degree titles are mouthfuls. Like, I think if they're less than 10 words, you don't get your degree or whatever it may be. So definitely very complex to explain that I just studied campus sexual violence policies and how they affect specifically women of color. So to get into it, sexual violence policies are something that were a bare minimum that we tried to create. Our turn, that was our focal point for quite a while, and same with SFCC, is getting those policies in place for bare minimum measures. It's something that will allow you to have a relationship with your institution and have something to rely on in case they fail you. However, keeping bare minimum policies in mind means that they don't do the transformative work that we want them to. So while we wanted these policies to do so much, instead they ended up falling short of our kind of dreams of what it would be. Many of them as well, and this is what my master's research focused on, end up pulling from criminal and legal systems, therefore kind of replicating what exists out there already and how those harms are replicated. This year, for example, we know how racialized folks, especially Black and Indigenous folks, are impacted highly by the criminal justice system and how we need to be defunding the police and defunding these systems. But instead, throughout campus sexual violence policies, we're actually taking parts of these and putting them in place. So we can't come to a world with consent and with justice, especially survivor-centric justice, if we're pulling these policies from kind of criminal legal systems that we've called out in a different way previously. Yes. And then kind of that institutional context piece, which is super important for us to recognize, is that institutions are not designed for many of us. None of us here they were designed for, which is really important. So they are for white upper middle class men, and we've kind of fought our way into them. It's also important to recognize how neoliberalism has impacted institutions, whether we're looking at universities, colleges, career colleges, CEGEPs, whatever level you're looking at. The neoliberalism has made it into universities and colleges, and these institutions are now businesses. So they're looking at their bottom line and they're looking to protect themselves instead of protecting their students, and how they can protect themselves from being sued and how they can keep their risk management at a lowest level possible, which has impacted survivors. And survivors are often the ones that are kind of left out of the conversation or purposely removed from the conversation, which is a lot of the stuff SFCC does acknowledge and recognize, is how like institutions as a business aren't there to protect us anymore. Not that they ever were, but they definitely won't now that we're kind of individualized in a neoliberal format. I don't know if the other two want to chime in here. Yeah.
Maybe just to say that, like, I think a lot of the points that you make, Sam, are, we as a SFCC, we kind of specialize in the horrors and making visible the kind of invisible violence in post-secondary institutions, like academic institutions specifically. But I think what's really important as well is we can actually apply this to a lot of any kind of systems of institutions that exist in Canada and elsewhere. And theater is included in that.
Absolutely. I mean, as we've seen on so many instances recently, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately. This culture sort of pervades all institutions and all of our culture as a society. And yeah, so in your research on policy and that sort of thing, have you seen any sort of success cases or shifts, or do you have any thoughts on how to move from this sort of neoliberal context where all institutions are implementing policies, so to speak, just to protect themselves and not actually to implement change or improvement for the culture of the institution?
Okay, I'm unmuted. The whole mute function on Zoom always seems a mystery. There's definitely movement forward. Policies themselves is a win. And I know we're going to talk later about kind of small wins and what that means and how they exist. So seeing policies as a win is an important thing, even though they do continue to fail us in various ways. And then there is, especially if you look at the context from 2017, when the Our Turn National Action Plan was written and released, to now, like, there has been major changes that have happened. There have been institutions that are being held responsible in whatever form they are. There are survivors getting justice through these policies and through these systems. So I know we focus on that horror story side of it all the time, but there are small wins that come out of this all the time. And anytime a survivor is receiving justice in their definition of it, that's a win. And it's important to recognize as well, like, these policies are supposed to be a system that's different. And so sometimes they work that way. They're not going to work that way for everyone. And it's often, again, those folks with intersecting identities of marginalization who are going to be not experiencing those wins, who will feel those effects of the policy the most. But there still will be some that exist. And then there are other, going back to the horror story side of it, there are other cases, like in our 1 year later report that we released in 2019, if we talk about Dalhousie University, where they follow the Our Turn National Action Plan to a T. They have their policy, it went from, I believe, one of the lower grades on our report to the top grade. It was an A+, and then they decided not to follow with it. So they decided to do something different and not follow this A+ policy, because they didn't want to do what would be great for survivors, or I'm not want to do it, but they just didn't. So it's important to recognize that policies exist, but they're not going to save us in any way at all. And if you've experienced sexual violence, you often aren't turning to your policy. Your first instinct isn't going to be, let's read this 30-page legalese document. It's there to help you when you realize that all your other resources and avenues aren't working. That's not where we're going first. Reading legalese, even though I'm a legal scholar, is awful. So it's not great for people that haven't studied law for 5+ years or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that it's not just about the policies, it's the fact that these policies become enacted by oftentimes administrators. Because I know, like, here in British Columbia, we have 25 public institutions and only 5 of those have a specialized sexual violence office. So the rest of the institutions are relying on student affairs administrators to enact these policies. And those folks are existing within a post-secondary system and structure that foundationally is not there to support people, particularly those, like we've said, with marginalized identities. Not that any identity is like inherently marginalized. Like, it's really important that we focus on, like, it's the structures that create marginalization, not folks' identities. Like, we all have identities. But yeah, it's really important to recognize that these policies are not going to change the entire culture of the institution. Like, our post-secondary institutions across the country are struggling from like a lack of public funding. They're ridiculously under-resourced. Like, people within these systems do not have the space and time to undertake the work that is required to do this work in survivor-centered ways oftentimes. And the folks that do are like in precarious labor, where they're working on like contract jobs within an office somewhere. So really, this is really, over the last couple of years, we've identified that no matter how good we make these policies, it's not going to change the way that survivors experience support through the institution.
Policies as well, to get more into them as well. They're a normative response to it. So we're not going to get transformative work. We're not going to get wonderful dream worlds, which I know SFCC wants all the time, is these wonderful worlds of justice, but we're not going to get them through a policy. It's very much a normative response to a problem, trying to replicate responses that are out there already, getting into like feminist law theory that exist already that just don't work for us. And we keep trying. So it's time to get into these kind of different ways, but remembering and requiring these bare minimums so that people do have these to fall back on if they decide that that is the route they want to go. Yeah.
Right. And like you were saying, of course, it's a broader cultural issue and has a lot of other implications outside of just policy, but even having a policy that acknowledges that this is an issue is a win, even if it's imperfect. And obviously you folks are working towards improving those policies and working with them in a way that maybe they would hopefully be more effective and more there to support survivors. So I'd be really interested to hear more about that, and we'll get into that. But I also wanted to just point out what you said about how people are not inherently marginalized, but that these systems and these institutions, the repercussions of the way that they're run leads to marginalization. And there are very clear and evident patterns of marginalization of identities and specific identities within that. So in your research or in working with these policies, how do you sort of frame moving forward with that? Is it just, is like the main thing like representation of the people that are implementing the policies, or do you have other sorts of approaches to that for anyone?
Yes. I think we're all smiling at this question because we definitely, it's something that we've been talking about at SFCC for a very long time. And I know that's part of the reason why I also moved into education portfolio, even though I moved into education portfolio during a pandemic, which means that my capacity is just diminished. But that's kind of where I'm seeing it moving, or I want it to move, is into more preventative and education resources, moving away from legalistic responses and moving into that kind of more holistic, how can we stop the issue from happening in the first place and work at the forefront of it, but also what can we do that doesn't focus on punishment and doesn't focus on carceral punishment intensely as well, when we're trying to figure out how to solve these very large interconnected issues.
And maybe if I can just add very quickly to that, is I think also like from what, I don't think I articulated this to myself until hearing you speak, Sam, but it is this weird situation of, we are policy experts. Like, we're an organization of student policy experts that inherently don't believe in the policies. Like, I think all of us have in our experiences, like, we don't believe in them. And yet we're the experts in them who keep getting called into the rooms. And we want to be in the rooms because we're the only students who get called into these rooms. And we have fought to be those only students who get invited into these rooms. And part of our work has been bringing other people into these rooms as well. And I think that's why we're seeing some of these conversations shift, is that constant back and forth. Law changes culture, culture changes changes law. And we see a lot of that tension, I think, in how we do our work as an organization, as people who very much do have that knowledge and are trying to fight against it at the same time as having our expertise valued in these spaces.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's really enlightening. Yeah, and important to sort of see that why you're working with policy and how it came to be that that is the case, and that is your expertise, despite sort of the institutional nature of all of that. Yeah, so thank you guys for all of that. I'm gonna move on to introducing Chantelle, who has been speaking with us already, but sorry, Chantelle so is also undertaking a graduate degree at Simon Fraser. Her past work with West Coast LEAF, the BC Federation of Students, and Women's Centers in Nanaimo and Downtown Eastside has given her a strong foundation in anti-violence work, Indigenous sovereignty, solidarity, and community accountability. So Chantelle, as we've sort of been talking about, and as Sam sort of gave us an entry point into policies and institutions and why they suck so much with regards to sexual violence policies in particular. But I was wondering if you could get a bit more into what work SFCC and institutions, organizations and activist folk like yourself have been doing to counter this work. Like what are the steps? How do you approach that, and what sort of goes on behind the scenes?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely want to preface by saying, like, there is no prescription or like formula for how to do this work. Yeah, so whatever I say, that's the caveat. But I will say that in terms of the, introduction of policies on campus, or the advocacy within provinces to get the legislation to mandate the policies, or whatever that looks like, I think kind of like a byproduct of what happened with that, which was really unexpected, both by students and by institutions, was the way that was going to really rally together all of the folks who were experts in doing this. Like, there's no way that I would have met folks like Connor and Sam and like all the folks across the country that I work with now if it wasn't for these policies being made in Canada. So what has actually happened in the background of all of this like pressure within the institutions is that we as student experts and survivors and advocates have like really started to create communities about what the alternative to these policies look like. Like within Students for Consent Culture Canada, like we talk about it all the time, like we are in the process through this organization of creating the kind of working and living and learning environments that we want to exist in all the time. So our organization is non-hierarchical, and we try and do everything very consensus-based, and like really we're just here to support each other in doing the things that we are expert at doing and learning together. And all of our comrades across the country are doing exactly the same thing. So really, it's like this incredible social movement learning that's happening, where we're all learning from each other, like what's working, what's not working, like gaining expertise through all of our research and advocacy, and also just like living mutual aid and community care while we're doing it. So really, if we want to imagine like what does the opposite of policies look like, it's community care, and it's what we're doing as organizers. So there's just like so much brilliance that exists within our movement, both like on campuses and at this national level or provincial levels, or whatever section of it that you're looking at. Like there's just so much potential to learn and grow within it. And yeah, so it's really just like a practice of making the future that we want to live in right now. Yeah, so I was actually thinking on this point too, that we could talk about the McGill study. So, or like McGill is kind of like a case study. We talked about it yesterday, about how it's really fascinating because at McGill, with the student rallies that happened a few years ago, which Connor was so instrumental in, is that like we identified that as a loss, that like in the end, like, we're still waiting for students to get the support that they're calling for and like the real actionable things that they were calling for. But just like the community that came out of that was so incredibly powerful, and is still having ramifications today. So yeah, I was hoping that Connor could talk a bit to that experience, because I feel like there were just like so many things that we learned from as to like what to do and how to do it.
Yeah, 100%. It's really interesting looking back at it almost like 3 years later at this point. And I still get calls from media, like asking me like, what's going on at McGill, like 3 years later. Or people like I meet people and they're like, oh, like, I remember you from that. Or it became something that we all really were able to rally around. And yeah, and it is this interesting thing of we had 3 very clear demands, which were that students be involved in any and all policy decisions and or any sexual violence related administrative work on campus, that students be involved and that their voices actually be heard, i.e. they have a vote. 2, that the policy becomes standalone, which means that the policy has its own set of procedures attached to it. It doesn't refer to the procedures of a basically academic policy. The 3rd one was an external investigation into the handling of complaints against professors in the Faculty of Arts. And to date, 3 years later, not a single one of those demands has been made. So in that sense, it is a loss. But at the same time, it was such this intense pinnacle moment of, I think, where so many people felt heard. The fact that we were able to get 1,000 students out during exams was, I think, shocking to every single one of us who was there. We were all surprised to see all of each other show up for each other. And what's interesting to me is for me, the success of that story happened way before the rally, which was when we were able to turn like basically the campus theater into a support space, because we didn't have support space on campus for survivors, and people were needing help, and I had a key to the theater. So that became the place that we would all go. That's where we planned all of our rallies. That's where we painted all of our banners. That's where we like held each other as we cried. Like it was that, for me, that was the real success, was being able to create that. And the reason that rally happened like a year and a half later was because it started from this very local, community-centered relationship building, I guess, that we had to do with each other as activists. And then from there, we were able to take the time, learn the legalese of the policy, figure out, okay, after it was shut in our face of no, because of XYZ loophole in the policy, there's nothing we can do. The amount of times I was told there's nothing we can do by administrators. And I know Sam has been through this. I know Chantelle has been through this. Anyone who has worked with administrators on this issue knows the refrain of, sorry, there's nothing we can do for whatever reason. And so then you learn to create the things that you want to see done, or any issue. Exactly. So I think we see these very visible public spectacle performance moments of movement building. And in the end, that was not what was the most effective at getting our demands. What was the most effective was the on-the-ground relationship building, movement building work that we did even years before, of just figuring out how are we going to support ourselves and support each other enough to get us to this more public, visible moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I feel that the more we build those like community relationships on our campuses, or, you know, wherever it is that we need that to happen, the more it actually creates space for folks to come forward. So it just becomes like this positive feedback loop on behalf of like students being empowered in like a multitude of ways. Like, I'm just thinking, over the weekend, we had an incredibly violent anti-Black police incident on our campus. And like the way that the community has come together, where we have like BIPOC students who are like, I'm so glad to be a part of this community, because I know that if something ever happened to me, I know that the entire community would have my back, and it wouldn't be silent, and it would be marginalized. It wouldn't be marginalized. And that exists like across a great spectrum of issues right now on campus, where it's just like students building communities with faculties, with each other, with outside organizations, that is just going to continue to make change. And really, I feel, hopefully force the institution's hand to make change, or we'll just like build something else entirely. You know, just like, if you can't change, like we need to just create our own thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing both of those points up. And I just want to highlight some of the stuff that you folks were talking about. I mean, I remember the rally that Connor led as well. I was also on campus as a wee baby second year, and I remember it was so powerful just because of the space and the visibility and the community that was built. I remember having, yeah, no idea what it was going to be like, how many people were going to show up, and the turnout was well, indicative, I guess, of the need. And yeah, I think a lot of times when we talk about policies, when we talk about institutions, when we talk about any kind of issue in an institutional context, or any kind of thing that seems important or needs updating, needs changing, needs addressing, the most common answer that I've ever received is always, there's nothing we can do, or go to XYZ and follow like XYZ protocol and someone else will tell you if there's something we can do, and then they'll be like, there's nothing we can do. So I know for a lot of folks maybe starting out in this stuff or having these questions, it's that sort of feels like, well, where do you start? And as you folks highlighted, there's a lot of other ways that you can and do end up starting, and that these movements do start and grow in. Like, there is power in community, there's power in space, there's power in visibility, just in general vocalization and expression of these things within institutions, in spite of institutions. Yeah, so it's really great to sort of just get a bit of insight into all of that and into those movements. And right, so I know Connor just gave us some lovely information about that. I'm just gonna introduce her a little bit as well. So as we know, Connor is a McGill alum, as some of us here are, and is the former chair of SFCC, now works with the Canadian Labour Movement. And she is intensely interested in holding both academic and non-academic institutions accountable for the violence and power structures that they perpetuate and uphold. And so now that we've sort of gone over some of the pitfalls of how these institutions work or don't with regards to sexual violence and their policies, and got a bit of insight into the brilliance and inspiration of community organizers such as yourself that have come together out of being told no over and over, and have made the space for you where it was not being held or created. I was hoping to talk to Connor a little bit about the power of storytelling and narratives within holding these spaces and in relation to these topics and anti-sexual violence work.
Yeah, thank you. So this is something that I was one of the reasons I was really excited about doing this, not only to get to speak with all of these like humans that I adore, but I do think there's a lot of overlap between theater and anti-sexual violence work, and I'm completely biased because I lived in both of those worlds for a long time. And for me, my transition in my life was directly from theater into anti-sexual violence work, and I learned a lot from that transition, and now transitioning into organizing another movements as well. And that's for various reasons. So one thing that I just want to make very clear as a former theater human, is that theater humans make very good organizers. So for any theater humans that are on the call, you make very good organizers. And why that is because you know how to convince people to show up. You have been convincing people to show up to your shows. You've been convincing people to buy tickets in advance. You've been convincing people to come to the previews. I had been doing that since I was small. And so now I can convince people to come out to the picket line. I can convince people to show up to this rally. Like, you know what I mean? It's all about that one-on-one conversation and convincing someone. But it's also about storytelling. And that's one of the most interesting kind of tensions, I guess, that I have found in my relating my theater world or my past theater world with my anti-sexual violence world was, what is my responsibility as someone who's holding someone else's story? When I'm in a room full of people who don't want to hear what I have to say, and it's not even my story that I'm trying to get through, what is my responsibility to the person who gave me that story? How do I get their consent to share their story with my words? Because they're not allowed in the room that I'm allowed in because of either an elected position I hold or just because of, like, I am a white woman and I'm allowed into spaces in a way that I'll be listened to that other people are not. So this is something that I felt like there was a tension with, not just from a theater aspect of it, that I think when we choose stories and when we look for stories to value, to put forward, to make public, how are we doing that in the same way as activists? So, and I don't necessarily have the answers to those questions. I think these are things that we have to be constantly asking ourselves, is like, what is our responsibility? Because it's going to change context to context, day to day, right? But we need to be asking each other these questions. And that's part of that relationship building, that movement building work that we've been kind of threading throughout this conversation, is actually asking each other, what's my responsibility to you and what's your responsibility to me? And how are we going to disrupt power? Because that's the other thing that for me is very attached to how do we choose what stories we tell is, okay, is the story you're telling or you're choosing to telling, is it aiming to challenge power? If not, why? If so, why? I think that's a fundamental question that we have. When we, those of us who organize TM, i.e. movement build, there's a little acronym that we use called AHA, which is AHA, and it stands for anger, hope, action. And so when you're talking to someone and trying to get them involved in what you're working towards, you use the AHA model of, you find what's the thing that makes them angry, you give them hope for how there can be a different outcome or a different future. And then you give them an action of how they're going to get to that future. What would that look like if we had that model in theater? You know what I mean? What if we took the AHA model of organizing and we told stories that way? I think in a way, sometimes we do. And that's why I'm like particularly thrilled that this conversation is happening with Teesri. And it's happening, this kind of activism, this kind of theater making, it's not happening in the big institutions, because those big institutions are the ones that are betraying us by writing shit policies, by giving us a story of what they believe in and what they do, and then acting in a completely different way, right? We all have these experiences, these stories, and we got to call them out on that. There's this great fantasy of neoliberalism that's been built that we have to constantly poke holes in, and it's hard. So all that to say, there is a great amount of work and a great amount of relationship between art and activism that has a lot of generative ability. And I think many of us who are involved in art making often have the question of, why am I doing this? How is this useful? Where am I going with this? I'm going to say those of us who are in movement building ask ourselves the question, why am I doing this? How is this useful? Why am I involved in this organization? Am I challenging power? I don't think so. Why is there all this bureaucracy? You know what I mean? So there's some parallel tracks, and I think we can learn a lot from each other. There's also something that I'm gonna get off my soapbox in a minute, but I have 2 more points that I want to make quickly, if that's okay. One of them is that both movement building and or activism and art, whether it be theater or other kinds of art, are seen as skills. And that's a commodification of something that you can be either good or bad at, rather than as a way to behave in society, right? Like, those are behaviors we have. It's a behavior that we make art. It's a behavior that we rally, as Chantelle was saying, that we rally around each other and that we support each other and that we create community. That's not a skill, that's behavior. And when we change our mentality around that, it stops being about whether or not we're good or bad at it and it's just about doing it. And we learn along the way. And so that's something that I think we can pull out of art and activism, because that's what we're going to need if we're going to change these institutions, if we're going to take down the white supremacist patriarchy, if we're going to deal with colonialism, if we're going to stop sexual violence. That's where we need to start. And theater is a really great tool in visioning. We can vision other futures together through theater. That is a possibility that we have. And SFCC, as Sam and Chantelle were saying, that's something that we're doing as well. And it's very performative. It's something that I think we're all kind of performers in the way that we're doing that. And so those are just kind of thoughts that I've been having while listening to folks speak. But yeah, if we are going to take on these big institutions and challenge what expertise and knowledge looks like, and really push back on the idea of skills and go back to behaviors, we're going to change shit. And I'm really excited to change shit with you all.
Can I just sneak in one thing? So Connor, I could listen to your soapbox all day. I just love listening to you talk, and I feel like I don't get to, we're so busy doing the logistics of things right now that I feel like it's been forever since we actually got to talk. But I also want to highlight, I'm an artist as well, but not the performative kind of artist. I'm an embroiderer. But I feel that the beauty of art is that it allows us to create a language that doesn't rely on English to communicate things that are often very difficult for us personally, that are difficult for people to hear. It has the potential of creating safe spaces for us and our audiences or viewers or participants to engage in that doesn't have to exist within a language that also continues to fail us a lot of the time. So I think that there's an incredible power not only in creating these other spaces where this can exist, but also entirely new languages that exist for our bodies, which are oftentimes totally forgotten about in the world that we live in, except for how much someone can make off of it through labor. Or that engage our heart. In the institution, I feel a lot of the time we're all just a bunch of severed heads, and that it's actually really beneficial for us if we can just remove the knowledge and experience of our bodies. So yeah, it's just the power of art, theater or otherwise, I think is something that we as an organization have really failed to tap into of yet. Especially considering the fact that a lot of us are makers in some way. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Connor.
Yes. Oh my God. Thank you for that. I mean, I love listening to all of you speak. I've known this from before because Connor directed me before, and I've been at some of the rallies and the activist stuff that we participated in, but I could listen to you talk about this stuff all day because it's so passionate and so real, and it's just stuff that I mean I feel like we all definitely think about as an artist, as an activist. Sometimes I introduce myself as an artist or an activist, and in both those situations it's am I that? Am I not? I don't know, do I have those skills? Am I good at them? Who decides what being good at that even means, right? And ultimately what it comes down to is that we're doing this out of a need and out of a passion for community, and that those forms of knowledge are just different and so powerful. I know that yesterday we were talking a little bit amongst ourselves about knowledge and what constitutes legitimate knowledge, and how knowing, experience, and community-based knowledge are delegitimized by institutions and replaced with bureaucracy. You know, but we're all doing work. We all have experiences as bodies in this world that connect with each other, that build these relationships, and that go through this. We need to move towards re-legitimizing that sort of knowledge and behavior. Yeah, so thank you so much for all of that. I could keep talking about this for years, but I want to make sure we save some time for questions for everyone that has joined us today. So I'm going to open the floor and give a couple of minutes just to see if any trickle in. So for attendees, as Heidi mentioned earlier, and as you can see, there is a question and answer box on the bottom right corner of your Zoom panel, I believe. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, feel free to type it there. And yeah, I'm going to let one of you three maybe just chat a little bit about what we've got up here.
Chantelle, do you want to lead through it?
Oh, about the slide? Yeah, so this
Yes.
slide just gives you a little bit of information about kind of how it is we operate. So we operate through three main portfolios, through education, outreach, and advocacy. So each of those bullet points kind of like touches on something that we do there. And then at the bottom of the screen, you have a multitude of ways to get connected with us and follow along with what it is that we are up to as an organization. And the image that you see there is for our massive multi-year long research project, which is the Open Secrets Report, which is a research project that investigates the power structures that allow for abuses of power, particularly within student-professor relationships, but also within the larger institution itself, and how institutions actually allow for that to happen through just a neoliberal environment, which we've talked about lots. But yeah, basically just yeah, follow along with us, and if you have any questions or ways that you would like to be involved, then please contact us through the outreach email.
I actually have one question, if you don't mind. All right, awesome. All right. Thank you for that. Honestly, like, it's very relevant to kind of what we're seeing right now at universities across Canada. Just like the institutional like failings and betrayals of like university admin, and the levels and levels of bureaucracy that make these process that makes getting justice for survivors so slow. But to get into that a little bit, Sam, at the very beginning, you kind of mentioned how you can't pull sexual violence policy or solutions from a punitive criminal justice system, as we've seen from the Black Lives Matter movement like this year, and from activists and organizers past. Like the current criminal justice system is it overly focuses on punishment, and rather than restorative justice and healing and rehabilitation. So I was wondering on if you can elaborate a bit more on that, how that relates to sexual violence.
Yes. I will keep it short because I know we're out of time, and there are tons of resources out there that say things much more brilliantly than I will. Folks who are on the ground in these movements of transformative justice and restorative justice. And I would highly encourage you to look into those. Mia Mingus is, I think, one of SFCC's like faves. So definitely would highly encourage to check her out specifically, but there's a ton out there. But getting to kind of the heart of it, it's moving away from those carceral systems. We know punishment is not going to get us justice that we want. If we look at it just from like a legal context, quite often we're not receiving the justice in any form. The punishment is not being obtained in any way. You can look at the pyramid of how reporting your sexual assault to the police does not end in a conviction. And then bringing that to an institution doesn't work in the same way as well. The goal should not be punishment. It should be creating these systems where we're able to have kind of justice in our own forms and receiving justice. So whether that's doing restorative justice practices, transformative justice practices, whatever it may be. And we don't want to, and we talk about this a lot in SFCC, we don't want to just kick people out of the community. So whether that is the community of an institution, whether it's the community of sexual violence activism, whatever community it may be, we're talking about isolated people that are removed from the community don't heal. So I know that we are talking about perpetrators here, but at the same time, we often will see, and if we're looking at intersectionality and marginalization that's done to us, the folks that are more likely to receive punishment are those who are marginalized through these systems. So that is most likely who you will see. So it'll be Black men who are more likely to be criminalized or punished in any form than it would be your statistically like white upper class men that would possibly be more in line with perpetrating. The Prof report does a good example of that as well. If you look at power, so in the Prof report, we explore, or Open Secrets report, we explore how professors are abusing their positions, but then they're not going to experience punishment in the same forms because they have this protection around them. So having these systems that are designed to do carceral punishment won't end up with an outcome we're looking for. Don't know if that answered your question 100%, if that was just rambly. I'm sure Chantelle and Connor also may have thoughts.
You had a lot of really good key points, actually, so.
No, Sam, you're never rambly. I find you actually like one of the most concise people to, yeah, you're always like so concise and brilliant. But I would say in addition to that is that while it's often folks who are marginalized by these systems who have the most violence actually committed against them through these systems, is that at the same time, folks who exist within these marginalized spaces like also have all the answers. Like if you look at Black and Indigenous communities, like there's so much beautiful work that is happening in transformative justice and healing justice, or, you know, whatever terminology is being used. But so we have so much to learn from them, but we also have so much to learn in terms of like, how do folks who are not from those communities use those systems and knowledges in ways that aren't appropriative. And that is, so those kinds of learning really need to go hand in hand. But yeah, I just want to draw attention that a lot of the folks who are doing the work in transformative justice, at least in my circles, are often people of color.
Yeah, just to quickly jump on that as well. It's also like the LGBTQ community that's a huge proponent of as well. So that's important to acknowledge. And then to second Chantelle, it's not appropriate in that work. We have seen how institutions will take systems that are really wonderful systems and then kind of horribly manage it and make it into this bureaucratic neoliberal system that's supposed to help us, but doesn't. So it's making sure that these systems are being used, but not being like horribly mangled in the process.
Great, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I mean, I think that the conversations about moving forward and addressing sexual violence, we need to talk about restorative and transformative justice and how we address things moving forward. So that's been super interesting, and I have taken note of some of the reading recommendations that you folks put out there, and I'll definitely be doing some more reading on that.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, unless anyone else in any of the other attendees would like to ask a question, I think one final question that I think can end on a very, very light note. So this question is in regards to organizers and burnout. Progress is slow. Progress is non-linear. Sorry, there's a lot of what we think is regression to like one step forward, 2 steps back. And especially in a pandemic, I think everyone's tired and everyone's exhausted in the capacity to do work with no like reprieve, with no recharging, with no like outlet. it's just not there anymore. So what would you say right now? Let's be uplifting here. What would you say to folks tuning in, looking to want to make change? What would you say to them in terms of like preventing burnout, or like just something inspiring to like just get us to like keep going? Because that's honestly what we need to fight this system. It's just, yeah, I don't know if I worded that well.
I can start perhaps if okay. So I would say two things. It's a hard question to answer. I think we're all asking ourselves these questions and don't necessarily have the answers, but are testing this out and are learning every day and trying to figure it out. One thing is there's a term called rigid radicalism that I have found very helpful in that something to avoid of there is no right or wrong way for us to be taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other necessarily in order to build movement. And we can't shame each other for like one or another practice through this. And so grounding myself in that, and especially as someone who tends to have like a very capitalistic way of viewing work and output, even when that output is in an activist sense, which I know we all deal with at SFCC, grounding back in that idea of like that fighting that capitalist mentality of what output looks like and what productivity looks like, and actually making yourself a meal and making someone you love a meal is productive fucking output. That is really important and part of movement building. But then the second thing that I would say, and I think I've told you both this, Sam and Chantelle, but I feel like something I've learned is like when it will come to like if I have an SFCC meeting, like I'll have worked 9 hours already at work, and then I'll have an SFCC meeting after, and I'll be like the half an hour before, I'll be like, oh my God, like I really don't want to do this. Like I'm so tired, and I'll go in exhausted and I'll leave energized. I'll like really not want to do it and really not put in the energy. And then I always feel 1,000 times better afterwards, because I'm like, oh yeah, these humans that I love who are doing amazing work, who support me, and yeah. So so just that, grounding yourself in that, not expecting a capitalist idea of what organizing looks like and what pushing back looks like, and two, grounding yourself in your community and the people who are pushing right along with you.
I can go and we can end with Chantelle if that works. I'll jump in really quick. Be kind to yourself. I think it builds off of Connor's. And something as well, like we've definitely talked about SFCC. We don't have all the answers and we will make mistakes. This is especially so this year during a pandemic. We don't have all the answers. We are in an active trauma moment that just continues and continues. We are 9 months into it. Something I keep trying to remind my team at work, because I'm always like, let's do so much. And I'm like, oh yeah, like why am I so panicked all the time? Because everything keeps changing every day and we don't know what's happening. So just being kind to yourself and recognizing mistakes will be made. These are things we can recover from, and taking time to rest, especially this time of year. If you are students, you're doing exams, and then you may have to deal with holidays and not going home, or going home, and it's a very strange year for everyone. So taking time to rest and not feeling that you need to be doing something all the time.
Oh my God, yes, all of these things. Okay, so what I'm going to say is actually like not from me at all, but from the absolute brilliance of the outstanding organizer Harsha Walia, who, if you do not know her, like, oh my God, know her. Follow her on Twitter. But anyway, Harsha and I work together on some things here in Vancouver. And I was telling her the other day, I'm like, oh my God, Harsha, I'm so tired. Like I'm so at the edge of burnout. Like I think that I'm actually past the edge. I'm over the edge. And so we had like a long conversation about it. And she said, you're probably a little bit burnt out, but you're probably just like more tired than anything, because she recognizes that the organizations and structures that I work with are actually like really, really supportive. And she reminded me that it's not actually like the work that makes you tired. Like I actually really love my work so much. It's the structures that you work in that make you tired. Like it's broken systems that make you burnt out. So yeah, like Sam, yeah, totally. Like Sam is saying, like the rest part is actually so important. I also I just want to like lift up the woman who runs Nap Ministry on Instagram, because she just like is the person who tells me every day that I need to take a break. The other day she posted this thing that she posted this big post that was like, this is not a reminder to take a nap. Like people keep messaging me being like, thanks for the reminder. She's like, I am literally demanding that you rest. It is not a gentle reminder. It is a demand. Because particularly for, you know, communities of color, like the state of vigilance that you exist in is just so exhausting. And to rest is really revolutionary. You know, it's like, we really, like Connor said, like we need to reconceptualize what rest and care look like and realize that those are actions that are deeply, radically revolutionary. And to really do that for ourselves and not remind each other, but like demand it of our communities, that they rest and that they allow us to rest.
Okay, thank you so much for all of that. That is all so important and so real and so topical. I know it's like the conversations we keep having about burnout and how to address it, what to do with it. And everything that you guys have said has been fantastic. And I was going to sort of bring it back to that, but as you folks did anyway, that honestly, like just this has even been really uplifting, recharging, and motivating for me, just listening to you folks speak. And I think that in that way, it's sort of like grounding us back in the why we're here and in the human and community aspect of it. Because when you're just thinking about fighting institutions and all of like dealing with broken systems and how to work with them, how to improve them, it can be exhausting when you're just looking head on at this massive wall of stuff, of institutional stuff. But bringing it back into the human, into the interpersonal, into the stories of people that motivated us to care about these issues, whether that be people we knew, whether that be something we've read, whether that be something we heard in a theater piece, and the stories of people that are doing that work, like we've been hearing from you folks. And I just wanted to bring it back to the one point that Connor said, that Connor mentioned earlier as well, with regards to this question of sort of where do you start, what do you do, and like what constitutes legitimate knowledge, is that law changes culture and culture changes law, right? There's no right place to start making change. It's just you have a space, you have people, and you collectively, you do know things. They may not be fit into like institutional boxes of this is a form, have you filled it out, do you have this form? But we as people and as individuals come together in spaces and enact fantastic things like this. So yeah, this has honestly been so great. I don't know about everyone else, but I'm feeling just recharged and reassured in the art and activist work that we've all been doing, just having this chat. And I'm so grateful to have been able to speak with you folks and get a glimpse of all of the fantastic work and experience that you have had over the past years. And I really look forward to sort of maintaining this relationship and more explicitly bridging the gap between art and activism and organizing. I mean, our art is inherently activist, is about organizing, is about people and stories. And it's just been really cool to have this explicit bridge. And thank you so much to everyone who is listening in. I know I can't see your faces, But, you know, as Heidi said, we all know that everyone is sort of exhausted of Zoom and being online and this format. But I know that I got a lot out of it, and I'm feeling a lot more charged going out of it than I was coming into it, as Connor said. Yeah, so I hope that you all enjoyed it. And if you have any other things that you want to say, or if like tomorrow you wake up and have a question or want to chat with any of us, we'll post the emails again in the Facebook group so that you can have a way to contact anyone should you like to continue this discussion. Yeah, if anyone has anything that they want to say to wrap up, I will give a minute or two for that. And then we actually stayed really close to being on time. I'm really proud of that. That almost never happens.
Thank you both for all your work organizing this. I know Sam, Chantelle, and I were so thrilled to have this opportunity.
Yeah, honestly, thank you so much. This is really a treat to be able to talk together like this and to see everybody talking in the chat. And I'm really glad that folks took time out of their already long day right before holidays to spend their capacity with us. It really means so much. And thank you so much to Heidi and Summer for your very professional and open and accessible organizing skills. You're amazing. Thank you so much.
All right, that concludes this amazing discussion panel. We will have more to the attendees. We will have more in the future, talk about multiple kinds of topics, focusing on multiple kinds of things. So if you're interested in the recording, we will be posting this both through SFCC and through Teesri. So stay tuned for that. And I hope everyone has a good night and a good holiday. So you can, yeah, feel free to stick back and chat with us if you want. I'll stop recording here.